Welcome to Godword Podcast. I'm your host, Casey. Today we're talking Marcus Aurelius and the Stoics. You can see I'm dealing with some weird camera issues here. We'll see about this camera. I don't know. Maybe I'll just go back to using the computer one. Anyway, there is a fine portrait of the early 17th century English cavalier poet Sir John Suckling, painted by Anthony van Dyck, a Flemish master. And it features a small Latin inscription adjacent to which Sir Suckling stands in the portrait. The one-liner in Latin reads, "Ne te que severis extra," and it means, do not look outside of yourself. Emerson used the phrase as an epigraph in his 1841 essay, Self-Reliance. As far as I know, the saying cannot be traced to the ancient Roman Stoics, but it is the most concise summation of Stoicism that I can think of. In the past 4 days, I've spent about 6 hours reading through Marcus's Meditations. At the start of this episode here, I want to try to do now what I think Marcus would do, as far as it's possible, if he were tasked with explaining a school of thought. Though it seems to me, reading him, that he doesn't consider Stoicism so much a school of thought as just the pursuit of truth. But anyway, here are some summarizing ideas, and I think this explains largely why Marcus and Epictetus and so many of these Stoics, or at least the writing that we have of the Stoics, is so popular right now. Here's some summary. Your thinking and your writing should be derived from nature, not from other writers. It should be clear and direct, never showy. There are 3 minds worth knowing: your own, your neighbor's, and the mind of God. Marcus says, give careful attention to what others are saying, and try your best to enter into the mind of the speaker. Be simple in your habits and thought, so that if someone asks you at an unexpected moment, what is it that you're thinking of, you can tell them immediately and without dissembling or lying. Nature is the same always, and it has a direction, and you have your part in that. Play your part. Do not object. Be where you find yourself. Put away fancy, Marcus says, or flights of the imagination, desire for what is not yours, or what you suppose could be or might be, under better circumstances, Meditate on death as simply another process of nature. Take care of your body and health, but do not go to wild lengths to extend your vitality. Keep your thoughts elevated on eternal things, even as you fulfill your duties in worldly affairs. Philosophy can be a guide, but reason, with a capital R, must remain your helmsman. The future, like the past, is beyond your control. And finally, to echo that opening bit where I sort of self-indulgently quoted Emerson just to show off how smart I am, listen to how Marcus phrases it, without any accoutrements. I shouldn't use a French word like that, should I? He says, dig within. There lies the wellspring of good. Ever dig, and it will ever flow. Okay. Now, in my notes here, I just have, take a moment to think about these things, like ad-lib style, but try to think like a Stoic. And let me do that now. Okay. I mean, if you heard what I heard when I was reading that stuff out loud, in one sense, it makes doing a podcast harder, because you're trying to think earnest thoughts, not to waste words, not to say what you don't believe, not to go on rambling beyond the point where you've given expression to what it is you want to say. be clear, be not occult, to quote Walt Whitman. I actually loved reading Marcus. I love the idea of Stoicism more than I remembered, actually. But it's part of it is that it's like, have some discipline, do the work, don't, what's that word? Like, try to please others, but basically do what you think you're supposed to do. It's like, it doesn't take much more than that, It's not that much more complicated than like what my dad told me when I was young, which is, look, if you're ever faced with a difficult decision or times get rough, just do the right thing. And like, there are times in life where I think that's enough. And if it's enough, like, what are you still doing here? You got it? Like, just shut this video down and go do the right thing in life. If it's hard for you to get out of bed, as Marcus says, like, remember that life is short and what you're here for is to fulfill your nature. So, like, shake off the cold and just do it, Okay, one of the things I admire most in Stoicism is its clarity, the fact that it can be summarized so briefly. My own writing and thinking tends to be ornate and overcomplicated. I excuse this by telling myself that I am justified because I'm trying to dodge censorship or to keep the rabble out, or what I want to say is so smart that it has to use all the big words and stuff. But the Stoics would not play this game. For example, although none of Epictetus's own writings survive, if he wrote at all, his student Arrian wrote down as much of what Epictetus said as he could recall. Arrian states that, quote, "Whatever I heard him say, I used to write down, word for word, as best I could, endeavoring to preserve it as a memorial for my own future use, of his way of thinking and the frankness of his speech." So what's the teaching here? I suppose it's like, say what you think. And maybe consequences be damned, Have some conviction, man. I suppose the rest of this episode is almost unnecessary then, if you've understood so far. In fact, it might be that all of my fancy episodes about literary history and the classics are, in the final analysis, unnecessary. We're all overthinking it. Be good. Try hard. Love one another. Endure to the end. What kind of a man can't live by these 4 edicts? If he can't, he's effeminate. Like, that's the Stoic attitude here. It's hard for me to keep this up, to be honest. I want to be praised for being so smart, and I want to rattle on and cite all of the most difficult sources to show that I am a man of especially keen insight. I seek approval. Like a child, I will behave in ways that win praise. Even this paragraph, where I'm turning on myself and self-criticizing, is but a more sophisticated attempt to put myself one step ahead of you, my audience, so that you might praise me, or so that you might give me money or ask for advice. I bought a new camera so that I would look better. I put on a shirt especially for this episode, rather than continue wearing the sweatshirt I always wear around the house, because I don't want to be thought slovenly. In Aeschylus's play, The Eumenides, Athena upbraids the citizens at one point. She says, and I think this is what I'm saying to myself whenever I'm not feeling like a Stoic, and like you might take stock, see if this is you. She says, "You wish to be called righteous rather than act right." And I feel that reproachment because I know I deserve it sometimes. The affectations of my speech, the ostentation of my writing. Indeed, never use a word like ostentation. And, the eccentricities of my dress and my haircut and all this, these are all potentially corrupting. Why? Because if I receive congratulations for them, even once, I will incline to become more like the thing being praised, which is never myself itself. But even this psychologizing is just another pathetic attempt to justify it, or to let myself off the hook so that I don't have to do the hard work of repenting and reforming. The good news is all of this can be overcome. The reason, with a capital R, is sufficient to the task, and the will is obedient enough. Improvement is always possible. All you need is a sort of clarity of direction, a goal, and the toughness to continue striving. Has pain or suffering set you back? It is in the will of nature. Adapt as best you can. Do not be ashamed to ask for help, but be mindful not to be lured in by the comfort that help provides. Recover yourself and continue your journey. Another element in Marcus that I love is his awareness that virtue often goes unrewarded, and sticking to it requires courage. Like Solomon, Marcus seems to have been impervious to the corrupting influence of power. He wrote, "Live out your days in untroubled serenity, refusing to be coerced, though the whole world deafen you with its demands, and though wild beasts rend piecemeal this poor envelope of clay." And how can such a thing be possible? Because basically peace comes from within, not from outward circumstances. And it is never too late. As I said, he writes, "Even at this late hour, set yourself to become simpler and better in the sight of the gods. For the mastering of that lesson, 3 years are as good as 100. This is great stuff, isn't it? I mean, and the internet, by the way, is full of inspiring videos about Stoicism that all encourage you to be your best self and to cultivate your virtues and to become better. I endorse those, and if that's what you're looking for, I suspect by this point in my video you've got it. Good job. That's the ticket. Cheers. Now go and be good. If you're one of those types who scrunches up your forehead and feels like you need a more complicated metaphysical justification for these simple moral truths, well, I'll give you that in what follows. But you shouldn't need this part, to be honest. It's not necessary that you understand all of what I'm about to say. In fact, you're probably only going to listen to this to avoid doing the hard moral work of reforming yourself. You like to have complicated opinions about things like epistemology and political philosophy, basically to impress girls. And so you're going to continue listening. It's a mistake. But okay, here we go. Marcus was born in 121 AD, and he was emperor from 161 until his death in 180, at which point his successor, his own son, Commodus, became emperor. Marcus's reign marked the high water point of the golden age of Rome, and most historians generally agree that Commodus may have tried to hold the standard, but after his reign, things got very chaotic very quickly. It is a most fascinating period of history. Marcus would have been about 5 years old when Emperor Hadrian rebuilt the very famous Pantheon, with its 8 corners, each dedicated to a different acceptable deity, and its open oculus at the top of the dome. I think I'm using that for the thumbnail of this video. It is the architectural embodiment of the idea of unity in pluralism. Indeed, Marcus was 12 years old during the third of the Jewish-Roman Wars, which resulted in total destruction of Jerusalem under Hadrian's leadership. It is not incidental here to mention that Hadrian had totally flattened Jerusalem to make the point, and banned circumcision, and made it illegal for Jews to set foot there. In general, the framing of this period of history suggests that Romans were pagan and polytheistic, whereas the Jews and Christians alone represented the monotheistic viewpoint. But in fact, if you study the symbolism of the Pantheon, and if you read Marcus carefully, as well as the Stoics that preceded him, you can't miss the point that Rome was in the process of generating its own monotheistic thought. Yes, there would remain avatars, but everyone knew there was only one God, and as the war with Judea showed, no holdouts would be tolerated. Marcus writes, quote, "The world order is a unity made up of multiplicity. God is one, pervading all things, all being is one, all law is one. In fact, the term logos was a favorite of the Stoics, and they understood it to refer to the world order, which is essentially the creation or nature itself, or like the structure of nature itself. I recently heard someone describe this, the way that the Stoics think of logos, and I liked it. They said, picture a dog chained to a slow-moving train, basically, a cart of some sort. And the chain is long enough that, the dog has some leeway here and there. But basically, he has to go where the cart is going or where the train is going. The train has a destination. Now, you can sway a little to the left or a little to the right, but ultimately, if you fight it too much, pretty soon you're going to be dragged along, okay? So this is the idea of, the limits imposed by nature itself. The driving thought behind this is quite closely related to the thinking of Christianity, to the point where it's tempting to suggest that Christianity is sort of the child of Stoicism, as the introduction to my Penguin Classics edition suggests. Says the writer at the end of a paragraph quoting from the Gospel of John and articulating a definition of logos, quote, "Thus Christian baptism is given to Stoic metaphysic." Stoic thought is unmistakably universalist because it sees nature as one. Stoicism sometimes seems shallow in terms of its metaphysics, but that is only because Marcus comes at the end of a 400-year or more period of Stoic thought. He's sort of the harvest. We can talk about his predecessors in a moment a little bit, but let me finish this thought about oneness, nature, unity. Marcus writes, quote, "All proceeds from the one source, springing either directly or derivatively from the universal sovereign reason." And again, quote, "Look back over the past, with its changing empires that rose and fell, and you can foresee the future too. Its pattern will be the same, down to the last detail, for it cannot break step with the steady march of creation." End quote. I mean, people don't generally believe this, especially people who get excited about politics, but Marcus is saying there that just in exactly the same way as if you've lived in a spot for 5 or 6 years, you start to get a feel for the rhythm of the calendar year, right? You'll know when the rhododendron bush is going to flower and when the sun is going to set, due west as opposed to in the southwest, and so on. And so these kinds of things are mechanical, and Marcus says civilizations rise and fall down to the last detail in that same way. Again, I hope you see in this that Rome itself, even before Christianity, was arriving at a logos-based universalism. What does this mean? It means to recognize and accept that tiny scattered city-states all over the Mediterranean must either accept total war forever, if they insist on behaving as if their own world order is different from everyone else's, or they must begin to figure out ways to come together, to mutually honor the logos, to find the higher order together. There's a really fascinating chunk of verses in Paul's letter to the Ephesians, written about 70 years before Marcus's time, that lays out this dynamic during this period, and I want to read it to you so you can think about it. Now this, of course, focuses on the distinction between Jew and Gentile, but it goes for the distinction between any peoples who existed in the Roman world at the time. So this is the quote from, I think it's Ephesians chapter 2, verses 11 through 16. Quote, "Therefore remember that at one time you Gentiles in the flesh, called the uncircumcision by what is called the circumcision, which is made in the flesh by hands, remember that you were at that time separated from Christ, alienated from the commonwealth of Israel, and strangers to the covenants of promise, having no hope and without God in the world. But now, Christ Jesus, you who once were far off have been brought near by the blood of Christ." in Christ Jesus. For he himself is our peace, who has made us both one and has broken down in his flesh the dividing wall of hostility by abolishing the law of commandments expressed in ordinances, that he might create himself one new man in place of the two, so making peace, and might reconcile us both to God in one body through the cross, thereby killing the hostility. Man, you got to pull that out and read it for yourself, to be honest. Here, Paul suggests a solution that I think Marcus would have recognized. The staggering idea here is that the various peoples arrived at a conception of the Logos, of oneness, of the ultimate unity of reality, around the same time. But upon realizing what different changes were implied by the Logos, different peoples reached different conclusions about how to proceed. The Jewish monotheism may even be understood as an early attempt to theorize Logos. All things are knit together in one creation. There is only one deity. What does that mean? Well, if you're like Moses, and it seems to you that no one else on planet Earth has realized this thought yet, and war is all around you, then you might think that all peoples of the earth need to be eventually brought around to serving the one creator. And if you think you're the only people who get it, you might imagine a sort of priestly hierarchy is necessary for this project. But if this idea of oneness was also spontaneously discovered elsewhere, and these other peoples also began speculating about how to bring the whole world into accordance with Logos, they might have proceeded differently. They might have formed the Delian League, or the Achaean League, or Alexander's Empire, or Rome's. They might have assimilated barbarians, taught them Latin, welcomed other religions, so long as those religions did not strain against the emerging unity. What I'm suggesting is that Rome's monotheism came into conflict with Jerusalem's monotheism, and that Christianity was a sort of philosophical attempt to resolve this conflict. A conflict which, after all, was only a conflict about how the world order should come together and who should be in a leadership role, etc. Rome reached its conclusions by way of philosophy, and Stoicism carried the torch all the way to Hadrian and then to Marcus. It had been working on this problem since the time of Heraclitus, 600 years earlier. The Roman philosophers agreed with the Jewish sages that all the world would have to be integrated, and that hierarchy would be necessary to accomplish that end. They only disagreed about who should be on top of the hierarchy. Today, when anti-globalists, nationalists, argue against globalism, it's generally because they do not like how the hierarchy is shaking out. But few will make the argument that we should resume the kind of permanent state of war, of all against all, that characterized the world before the Logos suggested itself or revealed itself. So when you read Marcus saying, "Love mankind," you have to understand that such an edict is suggested by nature itself in his mind. I mean, first-time readers of Stoics love the aphorisms without understanding their metaphysical underpinnings. Does it matter? I think it does. These fine-sounding life lessons are part of a bigger project of aligning the many and the one in order to reduce strife. Before the emperor was a Stoic, there was the slave Epictetus, my favorite Stoic, by the way, who eventually managed to befriend Hadrian to gain the respect of the emperor. This is how the big idea of Logos made its way up the chain of command. Before Epictetus, there was Epictetus' teacher, Rufus, and Seneca, who had been Nero's teacher. And there's a whole chain of thinkers going back to the Cynics and pre-Socratics, and all of them worked toward the synthesis that Marcus put together so beautifully in his Meditations. Zeno of Citium is often credited as being the founder of this line of thinking. But in fact, Marcus cites Heraclitus frequently. So we won't be totally wrong to think of Stoicism not as a school of philosophy so much as its fruition or its perfection, its most perfect refinement. If you're a Christian, I think it's helpful to think of Stoicism as the force that made the soil in Rome good for receiving the good news. And I think you'll benefit much by understanding the interaction between political problems and metaphysics that gave rise to this incredibly sophisticated line of thinking. And only when you grasp how incredibly sophisticated a tradition is will you be able to appreciate how perfect Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius' summations are. So that's pretty much all I've got here. I'm going to talk for a few more minutes state of the podcast kinds of things. The only other thing I would say about Stoicism in general is that I think it is valuable even if you don't understand all these underpinnings, because I get that get up and go energy from reading it. It's it does make you want to do better, be a better worker, be a better tiller of the soil around your house, better father, better husband, and so on. So that's good. I don't discourage anyone from reading the Stoics. I do think if you want to do the deep dive, that it's worth learning some about the history of the period and to kind of understand the passing of the old gods and the way that philosophy, it's hard to draw the chart, but as the sort of traditional religions declined and people believed them less literally, the rise of philosophy sort of replaced that in the minds of many of the thinking Romans, I suppose. And what they were thinking about is just what I've tried to express here, which is namely that you've got essentially constant war. I mean, I'm reading Herodotus right now. I've talked a lot about Thucydides, and all you see in this is not just war, but trickery and the kinds of things that ruin families and whole civilizations. And it's all because these people don't trust each other, they can't get along, they speak different languages and so on. I know that a lot of you who watch my videos you've had enough of the, we are the world global oneness project stuff, and I get it. I don't like it either. And I wish we could sort of find the halfway down the slippery slope point. But I will say that the more you study this period, the more you think with Marcus, the more you have to kind of concede that there's a certain logic to if I live in a neighborhood of about 600 homes, and if it were really just the war of all against all, every man for himself, I mean, that would be scary, right? But instead what we do is we kind of have a sense of neighborliness, and so even there I'm suggesting there is this movement from the many toward the one, right? You form a neighborhood or a community when families get together and start to trust each other. And then from there, what happens is you get bigger, right? The city grows around the town, and then there's a state, and then pretty soon you're talking about 13 colonies coming together to form a union or whatever. Or as I said, the Delian League, or the kind of oftentimes it is a military alliance that will bring people together for their own safety. Part of what I'm saying here is that this is all it may not be politically popular right now, but there's an inevitable logic to it that kind of can't be avoided. And so again, what we're really complaining about often is just who's on top of the hierarchy, more than the fact that there's order in the universe. I don't think we're against that. I don't even think I'm against the idea of unifying under Logos. If people could get their heads right and understand that Logos is just, as I said, it's that train that's sort of moving to where it's going to go. There are certain truths about, nature in the outdoors, that is reality itself, and human nature, that when you put them together, impose hard limitations on what we can do, what we can accomplish, what kinds of things we're going to be continued to be troubled by, in the future. And so this is where you and I might be willing to sort of acknowledge those limits, I hope, with the Stoics, and to try to realize that, look, we're not going to have a utopia. It's never going to happen. And in fact, it's like poison to try to keep introducing that idea, because it's I don't know, it's like trying to Yeah, well, it's holding the world to an unreasonable standard, right? Like the logos is not like pure perfection necessarily. It's pure perfection given reality, like given reality as we can conceivably understand it, something like that. Here I am. I'm talking too much because it's a big idea. I guess I'm trying to circle around it. Hopefully, you guys get the idea. I will end this episode quickly because I'm trying to sort of emulate the Stoics here. But let me just say a few more things. As I said earlier, my dad was big into this stuff, and it works. That's the other thing. It works great. Like my dad he's 73 years old. He can still golf effectively, like at par, and he helps me do stuff around the house, and he's a great dad and husband and so on. And so, like, I think of him as a Stoic, basically. When I was little, he would say things to me like, just remember, son, persistence and determination alone are all that matters. And it's like, oh, like that's sharp. You know what I mean? You kind of just take that in your head as a kid and you're like, yes, I got it. Or like I remember he encouraged me to memorize that speech by Teddy Roosevelt that goes, it is not the critic who counts, not the man who points out where the strong man stumbles or where the doer of deeds could have done them better. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who knows the great devotion, something, because his place will never be with those timid and cold souls who knew neither victory nor defeat, And it's like, yeah, hell yeah, man. Like when you hear that, that's true, and like be that. I think you should print that out and put it on your wall. So again, like I endorse this stuff. I just also think if there is a weakness in it, that you can find yourself sort of, self-improving, putting in the work, making money, going to the gym, and then all of a sudden, like the rug gets pulled out from under you because the world order changed, and maybe there's no preventing. Like maybe I'm sure that could happen to me too, even though I'm trying to study the metaphysics or whatever. So maybe it's unnecessary. Like just do the work, and when the world changes, change with it or something. Healthy men of all ages know that the Stoics are right. Period. If you find yourself arguing with them, it's because you're sick. They have the answer. If you have eyes to see it, see it. All right, like I said, next episodes. Well, I got my copy of Herodotus for Christmas. It's like this big, so I'll be reading that. But in the background, and by the way, I also did get Richmond Lattimore's translation of the New Testament, which probably after Herodotus, because it's also a big one. But I think what I'm going to do is the next episode, I'm going to talk about Ralph Waldo Emerson. Because Emerson's, I quoted him at the start of this one. He seems like a kind of modern restatement of Stoicism mixed with some Neoplatonism, which honestly, great idea, Emerson. I'm for it. And so we'll talk about that in the next episode. I think I'll just focus on Emerson's essay Nature, actually, in the next episode. And I'll circle back. I'll do other episodes on, like, Circles is one of my favorite essays by Emerson. We can do one on that, or Self-Reliance and so on. The next episode after that, I'm going to talk about Edgar Allan Poe and Romans chapter 7. So in particular, the idea of perverseness in Poe. And then I think one on Aeschylus. So that'll get us through like the end of January or something. Thanks to all the patrons. Our next secret stream will be on January 1st. I don't really have a topic necessarily yet, but so suggestions are open if you want to suggest a topic in the comments or something. Maybe I'll drop a thing tomorrow on Patreon about what we should get together. I think it does. Here's the great example of the Logos, right? We're going to have a secret stream. We're going to talk to each other behind closed channels or whatever and really sort of, dig deep and talk about things you can't talk about on public YouTube. But it's like, in order to make that effective, I think the Logos suggests we should all kind of try to get on the same page for each one of those. And so that's why I'm taking suggestions. Like, if anything I've said from like Dante recently or the pre-Socratics or Marcus, if we need to do more on that stuff, somebody let me know. If you haven't joined yet, consider joining. It's only $5 a month. I've got 21 patrons already. Pretty much if we keep going, I won't have to get a job. So think about it. Just think about it. Thanks for listening. Talk to you next time on the God Word Podcast. Here's the outro music.